Now we are going to look at different examples within different disciplines where we're going to take a very broad topic and we're going to try and see how we can narrow them down into better workable titles. So the first discipline that I'm going to start with is science. Now, one of the things that you have got to note within this discipline is that you have got to make sure that you avoid being casual. You have to avoid being vague. All right. So by casual, I mean, don't use casual or coarse language. All right. It has got to be specific. It has got to be simple. It has got to be straight to the point. You have got to name the exact biological marker, the compound, the condition, as well as the organism. You have got to make sure that you are as precise as possible. All right. So science titles are able to live or to die by this specificity. All right. Variables, remember that I had told you about variables before. These are very important when it comes to the science discipline. All right. They have got to be elements that are specific. They have got to also be measurable. All right. A population is also very important when it comes to the science discipline. All right. You're usually, in most cases, talking about a certain species or a certain group or a certain specimen, within this discipline. In most cases, you'll find that language such as the effect of, or the impact of, or the relationship between, blah, 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 blah. Usually you'll find these sorts of terminologies when it comes to research titles in the science discipline. So let's start with the first example. A very weak example of a topic is the study of plants and water. It's too broad, it's too vague. Right? It doesn't have any sort of clear direction. A stronger version of this title would be the effect of varying irrigation frequency on the growth rate of spinach crops in semi-arid agricultural conditions in Limpopo. All right. So remember our color coordination. Yellow stands for relationship. All right. So the effect of shows relationship between the various variables that are being studied within that subject. And what are our variables? Irrigation frequency and growth rate, of spinach plants. Okay, then we're not just talking about irrigation or spinach crops in any sort of location. We are talking about semi-arid agricultural conditions in Limpopo. So Limpopo is a province within South Africa. So that is the province that we're going to be looking at. So in other words, that is your context. All right. So you're talking about this element and this location in South Africa. All right. And that is part of your title. Okay. Let's take another example. So another weak example of a title would be cancer and diet. This is an area that is extremely important, especially in today's world. So you researching on anything that has to do with cancer, as well as diet, or as well as obesity, or whatever the case is a really great area to research on. But you cannot just say cancer and diet, because once again, it's too broad and it's too vague. A better way of expressing this would be the relationship between ultra-processed food consumption and colorectal cancer risk among adults that are aged 40 to 60 in urban South Africa. So our yellow stands for relationship. The variables that we have within that topic are ultra-processed food consumption and colorectal cancer risk. So in this title, we have two variables. Our green, which is the population, is we're talking about adults aged 40 to 60, and our context is within urban South Africa. All right, let's look at the next discipline. So let's take into consideration the law discipline. All right, when it comes to law, you usually find that quite a number of their academic titles would always have a full colon. All right. So the colon structure is very, very helpful. right? And usually a great rule of thumb to use would be to put the thematic phrase before the colon. And what do I mean by the thematic phrase? By the thematic phrase, I mean the main subject of your research should come before the colon, and then what exactly is the legal focus of your study can then come after your colon. Once again, this is not a rule that is set in stone, but it's a very useful tip when it comes to this discipline. All right. Make sure that you keep your opinion out of the title, even if your study is critical. All right. So a way in which you can frame your title within this discipline is an analysis or an examination or a critique of a legal provision, a case or a policy. The title should sound neutral and analytical, even when the study is critical. All right, let's take some examples. So, for example, your broad area or your broad idea is the law is unfair to women. Okay, a better way of framing this title would be a critical analysis of gender-based sentencing disparities in South African criminal courts, full colon 2015 to 2023. All right. We have put in a methodological approach in this title, which is a critical analysis. All right, your variable is gender-based sentencing disparities, and then your context is South African criminal courts. You have another context as well because you're talking about the years 2015 to 2023. Okay, another example that we could have within the law discipline is AI and the law. A better or a stronger research title would be Regulating Artificial Intelligence in Financial Services, an examination of the adequacy of the current South African legislative framework. All right, blue, which is your variable, would be Regulating Artificial Intelligence in Financial Services. All right, purple would be your methodological approach. You are examining. So an examination of, that is going to be your methodological approach. And then the adequacy of, that is your relationship, all right, of the current South African legislative framework. That is your pink, which is your context. Let's look at another discipline, education. All right. When it comes to education, it is always extremely important that you identify what is the grade level, what is the student type. So which students are you talking about? All right. What is the institution type? So such tips are very, very important or very useful when it comes to curating a research title within the education discipline. All right. So you can use various words. In fact, these words are very, very common when it comes to education, the faculty of education, the perception of, or perceptions of, experiences of, the impact of, on learning outcomes. These are some of the most common phrases that you would find within the education discipline. It is extremely important that you highlight what your population is as much as possible. So a rich population is very essential. You have got to be specific as possible about your population. So I'm really stressing on this. It's extremely important when it comes to education. In fact, that really is the main point of your research title. You are highlighting what is unique or what is really your population. All right. So just saying the word learners is not very helpful because the word learners is too broad. Are you talking about primary school kids? Are you talking about high school kids? Are you talking about postgraduate students? Are you talking about adult education? You cannot just use the word learners. If you're going to use the word learners, you have got to define what those learners or who those learners are. All right. It's better to say something like, grade 11 learners, or K-12 learners, something like that. And, you have got to define even where those learners are. So grade 11 learners, for example, in township secondary schools in Gauteng, for example, that is a real population that you can actually study and that you can work with, right? So you're not looking at grade 12 learners. You're not looking at, random, learners from anywhere. You are very specific and you're very focused. This is extremely important when it comes to the education discipline. Let's look at some examples. So a weak topic would be teachers and technology. What do you mean by that? That's too broad, you know. A better topic would be perceptions of foundation phase teachers on the integration of digital tablets in literacy instruction in rural public primary schools in the Eastern Cape. So let's look at the elements that are within this topic. Perceptions of are basically your methodological approach, all right? Foundation phase teachers, that's your green. You have highlighted it perfectly that you're talking about not just general teachers, you're talking about foundation phase teachers. And your variable is the integration of digital tablets in literacy instruction. So those are your variables. And then your rural public primary schools in the Eastern Cape is your context. Another example would be students struggle with maths. What do you mean by that? Yes, we do know that students struggle with maths, generally speaking. But when it comes to an academic study, how then can you narrow this down from it being a broad topic to something that is more specific? So, for example, factors contributing to mathematics underperformance among grade 11 learners in township secondary schools in Gauteng. So, what exactly are your variables? You are talking about mathematics underperformance. All right. Then your grade 11 learners, that is your population. So that's in green. And then township secondary schools in Gauteng is your context. Let's look at another discipline, humanities. All right. Once again, in humanities, similar like law, the use of a full colon is very, very useful. All right. Where you put your concept or your thematic phrase before the colon, and then you can then put your specific focus after the colon. All right. So when you're talking about various themes, when it comes to the humanities, variables would be themes, representations, discourses, ideologies, and so on and so forth. All right. Your population, for example, could be in the form of a text or an era or a cultural group. All right. Make use of the colon. So that is my friendly tip for you. Don't shy away from using it. Make sure that you use it to the best of your abilities. All right. So you put your hook or you put your thematic phrase before your colon, and then so what do I mean by that? I mean, what exactly is your study arguing? What exactly are you looking at? What is the subject matter of your research? Have that before your colon. And then what is the specific focus of that? You can then have that after your colon. All right. This, kind of gives an air of intellectual depth, when it comes to your title using this tip. So let's look at some examples. All right. So, for example, a very weak topic would be old books about women. All right. Rather than having that, a nicer way or a nicer title would be Silence as Resistance, full colon, right? Representations of Black womanhood in selected South African novels of the post-apartheid era. Okay, so what is your variable? Silence as resistance would be your variable. Then your purple, that is your methodological approach, would be representations, okay, of, right? Who is your population? Black womanhood, okay? And then in selected South African novels of the post-apartheid era would then be your context. Okay, then let's look at another simple example. So rather than saying that, my academic research title is language and identity, a better way of framing that topic would be perhaps code switching as identity negotiation, full colon, a discourse analysis of language use among Zulu English bilingual university students in KwaZulu-Natal. So what exactly is your variable or your variables? Code switching as identity negotiation. All right. Your purple, which is your methodological approach, is that you're looking at a discourse analysis. All right. So you're doing a discourse analysis, and then funny enough, you have another variable within your title, which is language use. Your population, which is green, is that you're talking about university students, but not just any university students. You are talking about Zulu English bilingual university students. And your context is that you're looking at the study, or you're doing the study within the confines of KwaZulu-Natal. All right. We have 2 more disciplines to go through. So let's look at the ICT discipline, for example. So when it comes to ICT, it is very important. So by ICT, I mean information technology, discipline. All right. So when it comes to this discipline, okay, it is extremely important that you name the specific technology that you're looking at. Okay, you do not just say digital tools or digital technologies. Which one are you actually referring to? Or which one are you talking about? Right? It's too vague to just say technology, because there's 1,000,001 technologies that are out there. Right? Some of the variables that you can use within your title are, adoption, usage, security, performance, user experience. All right. You always need to include what sector are you talking about? What is the location context? All right. So once again, the pro tip here is that using the words technology and digital tools is just too vague. All right, you have got to say, what exactly is it that you are studying? All right, are you talking about a mobile banking app? Are you talking about machine learning? Are you talking about an algorithm? Are you talking about cloud computing? Are you talking about cloud storage? Are you talking about a certain platform? You have got to name this within your research title. Let's look at some examples. So a weak example would be cybersecurity is a problem. Okay, a better way of expressing this would be an assessment of cybersecurity awareness and risk behavior among employees in South African financial services organizations. So let's break this down. So your variable would be cybersecurity awareness, all right, and then also another variable would be risk behavior. Then you have purple as your methodological approach, which in this case is an assessment of your population is employees. Okay, so you're looking particularly at employees, not just any random persons. And your context is that you're talking about South African financial services organizations. All right. Another weak example would be people use apps. Yes, of course, we do know that people use apps, honestly speaking, on an everyday basis. All right. A stronger way in which you can talk about this title is factors influencing the adoption of mobile banking applications among unbanked adults in peri-urban communities in the Western Cape. Let's break this down. What are your variables? You are talking about, in fact, the word variables is similar to the word factors. All right. Adoption of mobile banking applications. All right, so those are your variables. And then your population, you are talking about adults. All right, but you're not just talking about any random adults. You're talking about unbanked adults in peri-urban communities. And your context is that you're talking about these in the Western Cape. Sometimes you'll find that these various elements that I've spoken about, in including these into your study, sometimes they do overlap. All right. So, for example, in this last example that I have given you, peri-urban communities is also a context, for example, right? It's not just a population. So sometimes you'll find that there's just a little bit of an overlap within the various elements that I've spoken about in including within your title. All right. Then the last discipline that we're going to look at is commerce. All right. When it comes to the commerce discipline, usually you would frame your topic or your title around organizational performance, what is the behavior of consumers, financial outcomes, so on and so forth. All right. It is very important to specify what is the industry that you're looking at. What is the company type? In some cases, you might not be able to actually name the company, but at least name what type of company is it. All right. Who is the consumer group? Okay. Try not to sweep across economic claims, so try not to claim certain big or, general things that are happening within the economy, all right, unless you have a very clear way on how to support those claims, all right. You have got to make sure that you keep your title bounded, all right. So saying something like SMEs, in South Africa is very broad. Okay, it's better to say something along the lines of SMEs in the retail sector in Johannesburg. All right, is a much more better way of expressing this, because it's a study that you can actually do. All right, SMEs in South Africa can be something very broad. What SMEs are you talking about? It could mean a million and one things. It could be all over South Africa, but at least you're talking about SMEs within a certain retail sector, and you're talking about it within a region which is in Johannesburg. So once again, let's look at some examples. So a weak example would be small businesses fail. All right. A better way of expressing this idea would be the impact of access to formal credit on the survival rate of small and medium enterprises in the retail sector in Johannesburg. Before I break down this topic, one of the things that is extremely important is that you have got to make sure that when it comes to abbreviations, you need to define these abbreviations within your title. So it's not good to say AI within your title. It's better to define it and say artificial intelligence. When it then comes down to your written work, then you can then use the abbreviation AI after defining it, first of all within your academic writing. So, for example, I was talking about SMEs. You've got to define what are SMEs. SMEs refer to small, medium enterprises. That should be clear and defined in your title. All right, so let's break down the title that I had just spoken about. So yellow is talking about relationships. So the impact of, okay, so what is the relationship between the different variables? The variables that we have are formal credit and survival rate of small to medium enterprises. Okay, and we have our context, which is the retail sector in Johannesburg. Then another weak example that we could give is, for example, social media and buying. So social media and buying is a weak example of a topic. All right. A stronger way of expressing this would be the influence of Instagram influencer marketing on purchase intention among Generation Z consumers. So remember that I didn't put Gen Z. I put Generation Z consumers in South Africa. Let's break this down. So the yellow, which stands for our relationship, would be the influence of, and then what are our variables? We're talking about Instagram influencer marketing, purchase intention, those are our variables, and then Generation Z consumers, which would be our population, and we're talking about this in the context of South Africa. All right, so those were a whole range of examples within different disciplines that we have spoken about. So I hope those were quite helpful. I know that I'm not able to cover every discipline out there. And once again, I want to stress that these rules are not set in stone, but at least they can help you to some extent in curating a very good research title. So I would like you to try your hand at trying to practice what we have spoken about so far. And I would like you to fix these following titles. I would like you to curate a better title from these examples that I'm going to put on the screen right now. And I'd like you to put those in the comments section. So try your hand at it and tell me what are the different elements within the curated title that you have. So the bad titles that I'm going to put up are Netflix is addictive, TikTok is distracting, and students love coffee. These topics are very broad and very vague. I would like you to use these topics to create a better, more focused, and more a better research title, and I'd like you to put your ideas into the comment section, and I'm going to read every comment that you give in, and I'd like you to improve on this. Sometimes the best way in which to learn something is to practice it, and I'd really like us to practice what we have learned. Okay, so make sure that you drop your improved titles into the comment section, and I will respond to them. I'd also like to highlight that if you need or if you require any sort of advice or any kind of personalized help, there is an email address that I have within the description box. You can always send me an email and we can take this conversation off of this platform. All right, so I'd like you to give you a sort of checklist when you have curated your research title. And when you have done this, when you have put together your research title, I'd like you to use these 6 questions as a guideline to see whether your research title is actually workable and if it is actually academic or if it actually works. So, number 1, is your title clear to somebody who is outside your discipline? If somebody from commerce picks up your title from the education discipline, will they be able to understand what your title is trying to say about your study? Then number 2, does it sound academic? Are you using opinionated words within your title? Are you trying to use catchy phrases or words within your title? I hope by now you have learned that the more academic, the simple and more straightforward your title is, the better. So please make sure that your title sounds academic. Then number 3, does your title highlight what is the main point, the main topic, or the main subject of your study? So that is number 3. Number 4, does it identify a population or a context where needed? In most cases, like I said, in most titles, you'll find that this element is extremely important. And then number 5, is it specific? Right? Is it too long? Is it becoming like a paragraph? All right, so make sure that your title is specific and it is straight to the point. And number 6, does it match the actual study that you plan to do? All right, so don't come up with a topic and then whatever is within your study doesn't speak to what the topic is. So always make sure that your topic highlights and matches what your study is actually about. Make sure that you run away from topics that are too vague, that are too informal, as if you are having a WhatsApp conversation, with your bestie or your pal or your buddy. All right, make sure that you do not add in your own opinion into the title, especially if it is for a postgraduate study. When it comes to, for example, writing opinion pieces, then this is something that is completely different. All right, make sure that you indicate who or what exactly is being studied. All right, so just to remind you once again, your topic should have at least 5 jobs. It should have a variable, a population, a context, a relationship, as well as a methodological approach. But if your topic cannot have all of these 5 elements, at least it should have the first 3, which is at least your variable, your population, as well as your context. Once again, these rules are not set in stone, but at least they will provide you with a clear guideline or a very good tip on how to create a very good research title. So the last nugget that I want to leave with you is that a good title is rarely born perfect. You will not come up with the best title in the world or the most specific title in the world at the first turn or at the first draft. But you should know that it grows through revision. So don't feel bad if your first title doesn't work out. Make sure that you try your hand again and again. And I do hope these tips will help you. This is Research Methodology with Dr. Pree, where we make research simple, relatable, and even a little bit fun. Which everyday analogy should we use to explain another research concept? Up until next week, stay curious and stay rigorous.